Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. Well, the team we're talking about today is the Pittsburgh Penguins, as we do every day. Although this team, though, 6 losses in a row after falling 5-3 last night to the Minnesota Wild. So today we're going to look at the week in review, which is not a good week for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Talk a little bit about a gamble that Mike Sullivan made last night and why it paid off in some respects, and in other respects it didn't. I mean, like I mentioned off the top here, losers of 6 straight, to some degree, there's always going to be something wrong whenever that is your overarching storyline. Then we'll look ahead to the week to come for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I'll give my 3 stars of the week, and then as we do every single Wednesday afternoon, we'll answer all of your questions. So shout out to anybody who is tuned in live at Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube. Make sure you drop your questions in the live chat, and we'll get to all of them at the tail end of this show. But before we continue, also want to remind everybody that it is October, which means it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. We are proud to partner this month with the Rangers Ed podcast and Little Ed's Workshop to raise money for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Head on over to the link in the description below to check out our men's and women's t-shirts, as well as a nice selection of hooded sweatshirts as well. 100% of the profits for these shirts will be donated directly to breast cancer research and breast cancer awareness. But let's get into this show here. Obviously, we always do a week in review to start these Wednesday live streams. Well, the Penguins are 0-3-0 in this past week since the last time we did one of these. A 4-0 loss to the Edmonton Oilers, a 4-3 loss to the Vancouver Canucks, and then, of course, most recently, a 5-3 loss at the hands of Marc-Andre Fleury, which we'll get into, and the Minnesota Wild. I mean, it started on Friday, game 3 of a 4-game road trip out in Western Canada. The Penguins were just steamrolled by the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, there's not much more you need to say about that one. They gave up 50 shots on goal. Joel Blomqvist stood on his head to the best of his abilities, but at the end of the day, the Oilers were just too much for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And this is an Oilers team that has struggled to start the season. They certainly didn't look like they were having any issues against Pittsburgh on Friday night. The following day, Pens go up 2-0 into the second period. They give up 4 unanswered, and they really just didn't have any hope of coming back in that one, even when they pulled it within 1 goal, with Evgeni Malkin scoring a nice breakaway goal in the third period. You just felt like they weren't going to be able to get that one knotted up. They just didn't have any energy, didn't have any push. Part of that might have been game 4 of a 4-game Western Canada road trip, the end of your road trip, not to mention the fact it's the third period in the second half of a back-to-back. So, I mean, whatever reason, whatever excuse you want to give to the Penguins, they just didn't have it against the Vancouver Canucks, and that was 5 straight losses. And then, of course, everything coming home circled around Marc-Andre Fleury. Penguins go out and once again get a 2-0 lead, and then they give up 4 unanswered. They end up bringing it within 1 again. Then they give up the empty netter and lose by a final score of 5-3. So all in all, 0-3-0 in this past week, not good enough. And looking specifically into last night's game, they took a gamble. Mike Sullivan took a major gamble. And he said, what we're going to do is we're going to put Crosby and Malkin on the top line together, and we're going to keep them that way throughout the entire game. We've seen that be a card that has been played by Sullivan sparingly in his 10 years with the Pittsburgh Penguins. A lot of the times, it's only used in desperate situations. And we talked about it on yesterday's episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh. You were kind of getting into a desperate situation with the way that Sidney Crosby had been playing through the first 10 games of the season. I will say, the gamble worked. Last night, Sidney Crosby, I would say probably his best or second best performance of the season. Evgeni Malkin looked to have his legs. Rickard Rakell fit very well as the number 3 on that line. And you look at the way that they were deployed, it's exactly as you would expect. That line had 14 minutes and 10 seconds of total ice time. And that's in a game where the Penguins went shorthanded 6 different times. Now, on 3 of them in that third period, you had some overlapping time. You had some 5-on-3. But the Penguins played a lot of that game on special teams, and yet that line still had 14 minutes and 10 seconds. The next closest line in total ice time to that only had 4 minutes and 34. So it's exactly what you would expect whenever you load up that top line. You're going to over-rely on that line to give you opportunities, to give you offensive zone starts, to give you scoring chances. And that's exactly what ended up happening. They had 66% of the expected goals for, 31% of the total shots on goal for the entire team. And they were up 2-0 when they were out there on the ice. That's exactly what you want. Sidney Crosby finishes the game with 3 assists. Rickard Rakell tacks in 2 goals, including that huge goal in the third period to bring them within 1. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. And I gotta come up with a different way to say it, but it wasn't all fine and dandy for that Penguins first line. They still had their defensive woes, which has been an issue for the entire team all season long. You can't single or put that singularly on Sidney Crosby and whoever's been on his wings this year. But it's a problem with the whole team. It's a problem that the first line has had throughout the season. It's a problem that even with this new configured first line with all the stars, it still had on Tuesday night. They gave up 32% of the Wild's scoring chances at 5-on-5. 32% of the entire team. The entirety of the scoring chances they gave up last night came from that Crosby, Malkin, Rakell line. So it was all gas, no brakes. And I mean, that's been the way you can describe the Pittsburgh Penguins to this season. And the biggest question that I had is, can your bottom 9 step up whenever something like that happens? Whenever you put Malkin on that line and you essentially make it a top line and a bottom 9 is what I said yesterday. And the bottom 9, it didn't perform last night. There were a couple of shifts, yes, that I kind of liked what I saw out of Achari, Eller, and O'Connor. There were a couple of shifts that I liked what I saw out of Puljujärvi and Puustinen, and I believe it was Kevin Hayes who was centering that line. Again, everything was thrown in a blender, so it's kind of hard to recall without having it in front of me what the lines were exactly, especially because that bottom 9 got shuffled a lot throughout the game. But I think that you kind of saw the downfall of it in that exact matchup. The closest line, like I mentioned, in time on ice had just about 4 minutes and 34 seconds of ice time. The closest line in expected goals for was at 44% versus the 66 that you got out of that top line. And then when you look at the goals, top line scored 2, gave up none. The bottom 9 scored 0, gave up 4. The other goal that the Penguins had was Valtteri Puustinen. Yes, he's in that bottom 9, but he scored that one on the power play, and it was assisted by none other than Sidney Crosby. So you look at kind of the pros and cons, and they played out right in front of our eyes against the Minnesota Wild. And at the end of the day, the biggest con is they lost. They fell short once again. Is it nice that you got Sidney Crosby kind of back on track? You got Sidney Crosby not just to get on the score sheet, but a 3-assist game, a game in which he looked like he was more into it when it came to board battles. It looked like he was making crisper passes. It looked like him and Malkin were kind of figuring things out on the fly. And Rickard Rakell, like I mentioned, was once again as spectacular as he has been all season long. That's great. You need your bottom 9 at that point to, at the very least, hold down the fort whenever your top line is creating that much offense. Now, they didn't do it in this game. Do I think that it's going to be like this every time if they continue to use this strategy? No, I think the Penguins' bottom 9 showed glimpses, and I think against different competition, I think you'll see them have better results. But I still think that the pros and cons are evident. We saw them last night, and I think that's what you can expect if they continue to go with this top line, bottom 9 situation to continue to get Crosby, Malkin, and Rakell to be at the top of their games in the offensive zone. But what's next for the Penguins? Hopefully a win, right? I mean, they've lost 6 games in a row. The longer this goes, the further you're going to drop. But I guess at this point, there's not much further that they can drop. They are 31st in the National Hockey League right now, only ahead of the San Jose Sharks. So you can't get much worse than the Pittsburgh Penguins so far have this season. I think when you've watched some of these games, there have been glimpses that show, okay, they could be that team that could contend for a playoff spot. But overall, the defense is one of the worst in the league, and the defense needs to be fixed. It's not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to be a, hey, we're just going to move a couple chess pieces when it comes to personnel, and it's all going to be fine and dandy. No, you need to take a serious consideration and make some serious adjustments on the back end, both at the blue line level and on the forward level too. Let's not forget the forwards have not been getting back and playing defense well at all this year. So you need to fix that. Your goaltending has been great at some points, right? I got to go back and look. In the first period, these goaltenders, Nedeljkovic and Blomqvist, have at times been at tremendous levels. but then they always give up that one or two easy soft goals. And whenever you're getting shelled for 40, 50 a night, those soft goals start to accumulate and start to add up. Blomqvist said he wanted that first one back. I would tend to agree. You have to seal up that post, but I wouldn't put the other 3 that he gave in on him. And I certainly wouldn't put any of the 4 that he gave up against the Edmonton Oilers on him. We'll talk about Blomqvist a little bit later, but this is a team that, for the most part, all the good things they do, and they do a fair bit of good things, are masked by how bad they are defensively and how bad they are for certain portions of the game. Can't hold a 2-goal lead. That's not good enough. You give up 4 goals in a minute and 5 seconds or 3 goals in a minute and 5 seconds the way they did against the Vancouver Canucks. That's not going to cut it. You give up 4 unanswered to the Minnesota Wild. That's not going to cut it. You need to be able to, one, kind of respond to adversity a little bit quicker, right? You can't let things avalanche and things get out of control and things spiral the way that they have over the last couple of games. You need to be able to bounce back when you give up that goal, whether that be a weak goal like Blomqvist gave up at the start of that, that comeback for the Wild, or if it's a defensive breakdown like Chris Letang had on that 4th goal, or like Jack St. Ivany had when he made a bad change that sprung Matt Zuccarello for that breakaway early in the second period that led to the Minnesota Wild's 3rd goal of the game. The game winner was the 4th goal because the Penguins scored a 3rd one. But you can't have these mental errors, and you can't have these lapses, these 10-minute times or 10-minute areas in games where you just completely hang your goaltender out to dry and you don't have a pulse on the other end of the ice. Those things are things that can be fixed. Will they be fixed right away? I wouldn't think so, but it's something that the Penguins need to work on, need to get better on before this early portion of the season turns into, the lone portion of the season that you had any hope, because you can't win the Stanley Cup and you can't make the playoffs in October, but you can certainly put yourself on the outside looking in and make yourself a long shot in October. And that's what the Pittsburgh Penguins are doing right now. Up next on the schedule, we got 3 games between now and next Wednesday when I come on this live once again. They take on the Anaheim Ducks tomorrow night. Ducks come in, a team that is young, a team that is hungry, but a team that the Pittsburgh Penguins should be able to go out there and handle. To be completely honest, this is a young team, kind of similar to what you saw when the Buffalo Sabres came to town. There's a lot of talent. If you're going to give them their opportunities, they're going to take them, and they're probably going to take advantage of them. But you could probably claw your way back into the game if you do fall behind the 8 ball like they did against the Buffalo Sabres. And then on Saturday, the homestand concludes with a rematch against the Montreal Canadiens, one of the 3 teams that the Penguins have actually beaten this year. So there's a little bit of hope that if they don't get the losing streak behind them on Thursday, they might be able to get the job done on Saturday. And then they have their third Metropolitan Division matchup on deck for next Tuesday night as they go to Long Island to take on the New York Islanders. 0-2 in the division to this point. You're going to need to start racking up wins, especially because you've fallen behind the 8 ball with another rough month of October. We're going to move over to the 3 stars of the week, but before we get into that, I want to quickly remind everybody that it is watch along week at the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. I appreciate everybody that joined last night for the Penguins versus the Minnesota Wild. We were on the entire game having great conversations about Marc-Andre Fleury, who, let's talk about that right after this. Having great conversations about Fleury, having great conversations about what we're seeing with Sidney Crosby's struggles, with the defense's struggles, how long the leash should be for Mike Sullivan. All those conversations were phenomenal. I appreciate everybody for joining in. We're going to do it all again on Thursday. Penguins taking on the Ducks. Live stream begins at 7 p.m. Eastern. So I mentioned there the Marc-Andre Fleury thing. I'd be remiss if I didn't just, at the very least, address what we saw last night. Marc-Andre Fleury's Pittsburgh finale. He comes out and does a lot of vintage Fleury things, right? He does the snow angel in the crease after the one shot from Lars Eller rings off the post. He's able to shut things down. He has that patented smile from ear to ear across his face the entire night. He makes a diving save. I believe it was once again on Lars Eller, who was just kind of the victim of Marc-Andre Fleury being Marc-Andre Fleury last night. But he has that patented diving shoulder save in the waning moments of the game to keep the Penguins down by 1 goal. At the end of the day, he has 26 saves on 29 shots, but I think it's what happened in the last 12 seconds of the game that is going to kind of be remembered by everybody that was in attendance, certainly remembered by everybody that was watching on television, and 100% is going to be remembered for Marc-Andre Fleury. You had Marc-Andre Fleury chants ringing through PPG Paints Arena. He gets to give that one last, standing ovation in the city of Pittsburgh. He gives out a couple goalie sticks, and when he comes back to the bench, he looks over down at the other tunnel, and who's waiting for him but Sidney Crosby and Chris Letang to congratulate him on his victory and to bid him farewell for one last time on PPG Paints Arena ice. It was an emotional send-off from the fans. It was an emotional send-off for a franchise icon, a franchise legend, and somebody that is going to go into the Pittsburgh Penguins Hall of Fame, is going to go into the Hockey Hall of Fame without a doubt. So, kudos to Marc-Andre Fleury. A tremendous performance, a tremendous evening, a lot of memories, but similar to what we saw last year, a lot of memories for that Jaromir Jagr game. They fell short at the end of the day. A lot of memories for Marc-Andre Fleury and the Minnesota Wild last night, but at the end of the day, the Penguins fall short. Let's go to the 3 stars of the week, and also we're going to take a quick break after that. When we come back from that, we're going to answer all your questions. So if you're joined in with us right now live on Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, make sure you drop your questions in the comment section in the live chat, and we will get to all of them before we go today. But 3 stars of the week, let's kick it off with the captain, Sidney Crosby. He's alive. He's alive. He's come to life with that adjustment, with Evgeni Malkin being on his wing. 1 point in 5 games before last night's performance. 3 assists against the Wild. He's still allowing as much as he's creating, and I think that is just an issue with the entire team, but certainly an issue with the captain. But at the very least, he was creating last night. That was the biggest concern for the Penguins, is that, all right, the whole team's allowing everything. Sidney Crosby's allowing a lot of chances, but Sidney Crosby's also not producing opportunities. He's not creating offense. He's not finishing on opportunities that he does get. Last night, we started to see him finish a little bit more, create more of those opportunities. Seemed like he had his legs underneath him a little bit more. Picks up 3 assists in that one, and that's enough for me to give him the 3rd star of the week. 2nd star of the week, and this is pretty simple. I got a star from each game this week because for a large portion of the week, whenever you go 0-3, there's not a lot to write home about, right? There's not a lot of positives to take out of a 4-0 loss to the Edmonton Oilers. There's not a lot of positives to take out of a game in Vancouver where they took a 2-0 lead. They were playing a little bit better, and then they just completely crapped the bed. There's more to take from last night. I think that's their best performance that we've seen since they were in Calgary early last week. But still, at the same time, I'm going to take one player from each just because that's the way this week has fallen apart. So 3rd star of the week, Sidney Crosby. 2nd star of the week from that Vancouver game is going to go to Evgeni Malkin. 3 games played in this past week, 1 goal, 2 assists, all of those points coming in the game against the Vancouver Canucks. He started off the season red hot. 11 points in 5 games to start the year for Evgeni Malkin. The best start he has had in his 19-year NHL career. Then he hit a lull for a few games. He goes scoreless for a handful of games, but since then has looked really good in the past 2. Didn't pick up any points last night, but I thought that on the wing, he had that patented gallop back. He started to look more like the Malkin we saw in the first week and a half of the season and less like the one we saw on a lot of that road trip. But the fact that he's able to go out there, kind of get his game back in check, score a handful of points in a losing effort against the Vancouver Canucks, and also not give up many goals, right? Evgeni Malkin has the Penguins have outscored opponents 5-1 with Evgeni Malkin on the ice at 5-on-5 in the last 2 games. It's what you want from Gino. Now, whether he's on the first line as a winger or on the second line as a center, he has been kind of throughout the season the Penguins' best player. He had that lull for a couple games. He's going to. He's a 38-year-old center. He's going to have that lull every once in a while, but what you like to see is it was only about 3 or 4 games before he was able to get back on his horse, have a 3-point performance, and then have a very good performance last night despite not finding his way onto the score sheet. So he's going to be my number 2 star of the week. Number 1, I'm going to give it to the kid because his 2 games this past week have been really the biggest redeeming quality of this team. That's Yoel Blomqvist. It was Flower versus Flower last night, and Blomqvist showed up in a big way. 2 games played. He did give up 8 goals, which is a 4.0 goals against average. Not great numbers, but when you look at what he had to contend with, when you look at what he had to face, you know undoubtedly that this kid is the number 1 star of the week. A .909 save percentage, which for those who aren't adept at math, and for those who look at that and say, well, that's around league average, maybe slightly above league average, he has made 80 saves on 88 shots. Not this season. In the past 2 games, he faced 50 against the Edmonton Oilers. He faced 38 against the Minnesota Wild last night. And if the Wild weren't up by multiple goals in that third period, he probably would have faced 50 again, because it seemed like they took their foot off the pedal a little bit, trying to play that prevent defense, make sure that they didn't give up any grade A opportunities to those of Crosby and those of Malkin. Blomqvist has been spectacular. 2 losses this week, but they're both behind a non-existent defense. The kid continues to impress. Yes, he gave up a weak goal in that first one yesterday, but I think he bounced back. And I think if you look at the bulk majority of his performance this season, you can make an argument that he is one of the 2 or 3 best players that the Penguins have had to offer this season. And that's saying a lot for a player that really only got his opportunity. And yes, would he have gotten an opportunity this season? 100%. But he really only got his opportunity early in the year because Alex Nedeljkovic was on the shelf and because Tristan Jarry is playing at an ECHL level. That's why he's up here. He's making the most of his opportunities, and he certainly deserves more. So he is the first star of the week for the tip of the iceberg. Third goes to Crosby. Second star goes to Malkin. And the first star of the week goes to netminder Yoel Blomqvist. But we're going to take a quick break. When we return, answering all of your questions. So if you're tuned in live with us at the tip of the iceberg, make sure you throw it in the live chat below. We'll be right back in just a few moments. Welcome back to the Tip of the Iceberg Live. Shout out to everybody that submitted a question here. We're going to go through every single one of them. Remember, we are in watch-along week, so we will be live tomorrow night for the game, Penguins versus Ducks. I'll be sitting there trying to get a couple of guests lined up, and we'll sit there back and watch the Penguins try to climb out of this 6-game losing streak and try to climb out of the basement in the Eastern Conference. But let's start things off for these questions with my guy, Evan. Evan says, could the Penguins pull off an Oilers comeback from the bottom of the league this year? I would say that's going to be a tough task, Evan. Could they? Never want to rule it out, right? You always want to say, well, maybe there's a chance. There's always a chance. But what the Oilers did last year was historic, and it really helps whenever you have a guy like Connor McDavid putting up 132 points. I just don't see anybody on the Penguins who are able to go out there and do that. Yeah, Sidney Crosby in his heyday could. Yes, I did predict before the season that Sidney Crosby could have a 100-point season if the power play is better. And, well, here we are 11 games in, and I think overall the power play has been better, but Sidney Crosby as a whole has not. Now, maybe last night kickstart something and he goes on this crazy run that solidifies him as a Mount Rushmore top 4 player of all time because he has a crazy age 37 season. Maybe. So is there a chance? Yeah, there's a chance. But at the same time, I think this Penguins team is much more flawed than that Oilers team was last year when they got off to a slow start. And I just don't think they have the horses to be able to make that comeback in a very competitive Eastern Conference. Let's not mince words about the fact that I'm pretty sure everybody in the Atlantic Division has a winning record right now. I want to check that because the Atlantic Division coming into this season, you had the question of like, all right, which team is just going to surprisingly be bad? There really hasn't been any of them. Okay, there's 3 teams with a losing record. Buffalo is 4-5-1, Montreal is 4-5-1, and Boston is 4-5-1. But all of them have 9 points in the standings right now. That would be good for 5th in the Metro, and that's 8th in the Atlantic. So it's going to be a competitive conference all season long. The Penguins are putting themselves behind the eight ball, and they got a lot of older players on this team that as the season progresses, you're going to see lulls. We saw it last season. We saw it the season before. And honestly, we're seeing it to start this season when they should be, at full strength. They should have their legs underneath them. So, how will Crosby hold up this year? How will Malkin hold up this year? He's already gotten off to a torrid pace. And will you get Chris Letang bouncing back? Will you get Lars Eller performing at the level that he has? Will Nola Chari be able to stay healthy? These are all big questions that, to me, make it hard to imagine them kind of having that drastic and dramatic comeback like the Oilers did last season. Eric P. wants to know, do you think Erik Karlsson will eventually ask to be traded to chase a cup? See, I haven't talked to Erik Karlsson, and honestly, he hasn't really spoken much on record on how much he wants to end his career, when he wants to end his career. But when he came to Pittsburgh, one of the things he said as to why he waived his trade clause was, well, I want to chase a cup, and that's something that this team always does. Well, they didn't last year. Doesn't seem like they're going to do it this year, and to be completely honest, doesn't seem like that's something that's going to happen anytime in the near future. So will Erik Karlsson waive his no trade clause or ask to be traded to chase a cup? Maybe not. I don't know. I think that at the end of the day, the only person that can really answer that is Erik Karlsson. Do I think that he wants a Stanley Cup? Undoubtedly. Do I think that, he would want to chase a Stanley Cup? You would have to think so, because that's one piece of the puzzle that he's missing. I mean, he's a guy he's headed for Toronto. He's going to go and be a Hockey Hall of Famer. He is a multi-time Norris Trophy winner. He has a lot of personal hardware, but he doesn't have that one thing that every hockey player is chasing, and that's a Stanley Cup. So maybe towards the end of this season, maybe after this season, but at the same time, with the way he's performing right now and the cap hit that he has, you also have to question what cup contender is going to be able to, let alone want to, bring on Erik Karlsson at this stage of the game. I don't think it happens mid-season because cup contenders don't just have $10 million lying around. So I think that would have to be an off-season type move, and I think it would have to be probably after next season when he only has 1 year left of that contract. So a team that's really going for it can try to fit that under, or the Penguins would be more willing to eat some of that salary cap if it's only at 1 year. Let's go to Tanger, who was with us yesterday, so appreciate Tanger joining for the second straight day on these live streams. Says, what if Fleury is pulling the biggest prank of all and comes back to Pittsburgh for one more season? Not likely, just hoping for a Hail Mary for this team. I can see something similar to that happening. In fact, I expect something similar to that to happen. I think that he'll sign a one-day contract with the Penguins after this season ends and retire as a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. But I do think he's done after this season. I think a lot of people kind of expected him to be done after last season. Year 20, Hall of Fame resume. He has kind of fallen off a little bit. He is a bona fide backup goaltender in the league, but as we saw last night, he can still go out there and steal a game. He can still go out there and win you games, but he's not a number one goalie anymore. Could the Penguins use a backup goaltender next year? Who knows where they're going to go with their goaltending situation. Let's not forget, Tristan Jarry is still on this team, and that is still a situation that needs to resolve itself. But also, Joel Blomqvist looks like he could be a starting goaltender in the near future for the Penguins. And you also have Alex Nedeljkovic for another year, who I think is one of the better backups in the National Hockey League. So will they have space for him? Probably not. Do I think he's pulling a prank? No, I think he's honestly done after the season. I think you could see the emotion in his eyes and the emotion in his voice last night when he was talking to the media after the game. It seems like he's done. It seems like he's done, and this is something that has been thought out and is not something that he's going to bounce back on. Unless, the only way I could see him doing that and kind of going back on that is if the Wild go on a run and come up just short. And him saying, man, I really want to win that other cup. And Bill Guerin saying, well, we could use another backup goaltender for next year. That's the only way I see Fleury coming back for another season. Let's go over to Mac Brunson, who says, I wanted to say I love the content. Appreciate you as always, Mac. Says, secondly, I hope Dubas does right by Fleury and trades for him. I don't care what he gives up to get him. I want him back. If the Penguins were maybe 2 years further down the line of this rebuild, I would say there's a chance, because I think if they were 2 years further down in the line of this rebuild, they probably wouldn't have a $5 million goaltender, and they probably wouldn't have signed Alex Nedeljkovic for 2 years at $2.5 million to be the backup. I think they would have just said, you know what? We'll give Blomqvist a shot, because there's no chance that we're going anywhere. But they felt like they had a chance to make the playoffs this year. And then, once you make the playoffs, who knows what happens? That's where they're at this season. It would be fun to see Fleury back in Pittsburgh in a playing capacity, but I think the door is unfortunately closed on that one. Let's go to whatever other questions you guys have thrown in here lately. Let's go to Lenny, who says, not a question, but I'm happy that Graves isn't the biggest liability on this team at the moment. Thank you for somebody else for kind of recognizing that. Ryan Graves, and I think especially last night, people are going to say, well, he was the guy getting back late in that Matt Zuccarello breakaway that put the Penguins down 3-2. Yeah, that wasn't his fault. For one, Drew O'Connor can't turn the puck over at the blue line like that. And for two, if you're going to do that, not if you're going to do that, you just can't. And for two, Jackson and Ivany got caught in a change. And that's where the defense leaked a little bit. So that one wasn't on Graves. I thought Ryan Graves had one of his best performances as a Penguin last night. I thought he was playing physical against a physical opponent. I thought he was making smart decisions with the puck. I saw multiple block shots. I saw less giveaways. I feel like that's always going to be part of his game, at least for this year, because it was a major part of his game last year. You're not going to be able to just kind of wipe that away and completely get it out of your performance. But I thought he limited the amount of giveaways that he had, and I thought he overall played a good game. But no, he is not the biggest defensive liability that the Penguins have at the moment. I think that designation goes to Chris Letang, and there's a close second and third between Matt Grzelcyk and Erik Karlsson, but it is certainly not Ryan Graves. Christopher Hart says Rust needs to be traded. Unfortunately, he's injured most of the time. Well, part of your comment here is the reason that the other part is not going to happen. Rust is injury prone, which is going to take away a lot of people that want to trade for him. Secondly, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to double check this here, Brian Rust still has a full no movement clause. He signed that for the first 3 years of his contract. It transitions over to a modified clause after the season, but as of right now, he has that. Actually, no. He has a full no movement clause this season. I was right about that, but there is no clauses after this season, and that's when you can start to look at him potentially being more of a trade candidate. But the Pittsburgh Penguins right now, I just don't know. First of all, nobody's going to trade for him while he's injured, but I'm not sure how much you're going to get back for him if he has to be the one that kind of A-OKs a trade, right? He's going to want to go to a contender probably. He's going to want to go to a place that's going to be good for his family. So you're probably ruling out a lot of those Canadian teams. This is a American-born guy that stayed in America his entire career. A lot of the times, and I don't want to speak for him, but a lot of the times those guys want to stay closer to family and want to stay in the United States. So, it narrows things down, especially considering he has that full no movement clause. I don't think he needs to be traded. I think if the Penguins get to a point where they're pulling the ripcord on this season, you approach Brian Rust and say, hey, what would you think if we started looking around for a landing spot for you? And you work with Brian Rust. They've done it in the past. They essentially did that with Marc-Andre Fleury. They approached him early in that 2016-17 season and said, hey, the Vegas expansion draft is coming up. We want to let you know that you're the player that we're probably going to dangle out there. And from what we've heard, Vegas is likely going to take you with their pick for the Pittsburgh Penguins. They did it there. Maybe they do it again here. I don't think he needs to be traded. When he's healthy, he's great. When he's injured, obviously it slows down his paces, but each of the last 3 seasons, he's been over a 30-goal pace. So when he plays, he's good. And if you're still trying to make the playoffs, which as of right now, Kyle Dubas is probably holding out hope because he was doing that coming into the season. I don't think that plans have changed that quickly, only 11 games in. I would imagine that unless they fall far out of it, Rust being traded is not something that comes up as a conversation at any point this season. Let's go over to Michael Thompson, who says, if we trade Erik Karlsson, we can get picks and assets if it's possible to pull off. Yeah, you would. But again, limited. There's a reason that when the Penguins acquired Erik Karlsson, the trade looked like an absolute steal for the Pittsburgh Penguins. They essentially traded all their bad contracts and a first-round pick for Erik Karlsson, a player that, whatever you think of him now or not, a player that was coming off of a 100-point season and a Norris Trophy season. Those trades don't happen a lot. Why did it happen? Because he has a full no movement clause. Because he dictates where he goes. And that kind of negates a lot of what you can get in return, even if he turns it around and has a phenomenal next few months leading up to the trade deadline. And then your team's struggling and you say, you know what, we want to try to trade Karlsson. It's up to him. If he doesn't want to go anywhere, if he says, you know what, I kind of like Pittsburgh. The IC lights flowing. The fans are always in the building, even though that we've been one of the worst teams in the National Hockey League. I think I just want to stay here. Maybe he likes Sid and playing at Oakmont. Maybe he just wants to stay here. And if that's the case, Penguins can't do anything about it. So that's going to negate how much you can get back in return as far as picks and assets. But if he decides that he wants to go chase a cup like we talked about earlier, yeah, potentially you do get picks and assets back. You do help yourself along the line of this rebuild. And at the end of the day, that's what you're going to try to do as time wears on, as these seasons wear on, as the window continues to get closed and locked shut on this window of Pittsburgh Penguins contention. But I think that for Erik Karlsson, if you're looking into the trade of him, you're not going to get very much back just because of the situation that you're in right now. Let's go to That's Right, who says, when would they fire Mike Sullivan? 2 more losses? 3? For those looking to see Mike Sullivan fired in the next couple of weeks, which that's what it kind of alludes to from That's Right here, you're going to be sadly disappointed. You're going to be holding your breath for a very long time. He just started a 3-year contract extension. While I don't think he's untouchable, and while I do think a lot of the problems the Penguins have could be fixed if you get a new voice in there, a new head coach, a little bit of a new kind of thought process, I do think that it could help the Penguins. I don't think they're at that point right now. I don't, because I think the expectations before the season were lowered. And I think that if they were going into the season saying, we're going to be a top 3 team in the Metro, we're going to be a team that's going to be vying for a playoff spot and in a playoff spot all season long, we're going to be a team that's going to be able to beat every single opponent that comes up in front of us, and they had this start, you'd be close. The hot seat would be turned up. But they came into the season knowing the ceiling is probably a bubble playoff team. The ceiling is probably wild card 1, wild card 2. And for them to struggle this mightily when those were the expectations, I don't think it leads to the fact that the hot seat is turned on really at all at this point. I think that he has the rest of this season. I think that's the grace that he gets from the Pittsburgh Penguins. Once next year starts, I think that's when things start to heat up, or depending on how much they bottom out by the end of this season. I think that you don't start having that conversation until around the trade deadline. I think that he's just going to get too much grace for that. I think the Pittsburgh Penguins are aware that he is thought of very highly in NHL circles, and they're not just going to leave him out like, Gerard Gallant has been left out in so many other places. Pens aren't going to do that. They have a reputation as an organization that takes care of their coaches, takes care of their employees, although that's changed a little bit. I'm not going to go into that, but I don't think if you're trying to hold your breath for Mike Sullivan to be fired, you're going to be holding it for a very long time. Let's go over to Ace80, who says, do we try to take advantage of the Avs injury situation? They're playing a defenseman on the wing tonight, and try to ship out Beauvillier or a different forward while they're desperate. How desperate are they at this point of the season, though? That's the question. Are they desperate for goaltending? Yeah. I mean, Tristan Jarry's been bad, but Alexander Georgiev has been way worse, and he's been given a lot more leeway than Tristan Jarry was given in Pittsburgh. But that's going to be the type of situation you look to take advantage of. Maybe even, we saw it yesterday with the Detroit Red Wings shipping out Oli Mata, former Penguin, to the Utah Hockey Club. Why? Because Utah lost Sean Durzi and John Marino. That's the type of situations you look at. Do I think that anybody on a second to last place Penguins team is going to be of interest to teams around the league right now? Probably not. Specifically not a guy like Anthony Beauvillier. Yeah, he has 3 goals. Yeah, he has 4 points in 11 games, which is not awful for a guy that has fluctuated in the lineup. But these guys watch the games. These guys have scouts that watch the games. They know that Anthony Beauvillier started on the first line with Crosby. Crosby got off to one of his worst starts of his career, and Beauvillier was quickly shipped down in the lineup. There's no reason for the Avs to go out there and try to get Beauvillier. I think that right now the Penguins have a lot of players that could potentially turn into trade assets in the future, but right now they're probably a team that other teams are saying, we're just not going to touch that for the moment, and we'll wait to see if they're able to bounce back a little bit, because they have been just that bad this early in the season. Let's go back over to Evan, who checks in with another question here. Says, McGroarty still doesn't have a point in the AHL. When do we need to start being worried about the trade and his performance. You got plenty of time for that, Evan. I know everybody wanted to see him come in here and light the world on fire. They wanted to see him come in here and be a Logan Stankoven. They wanted him to come in here and be, Jack Hughes whenever he came into the league, which that's an unfair comparison because Jack Hughes was the first overall pick. But they wanted him to come in here and make a difference at the NHL level. He didn't do that in his 3-game sample size. He got shipped back down to the AHL. And as you mentioned, he still doesn't have a point at the AHL level. You got to be patient with him, though, because he's only 20. He's 20 years old, and this is the first professional hockey that he's ever played. To answer your question, truly and honestly here, you need to start being worried the second Braden Yeager surpasses him. Because the second Braden Yeager surpasses him, that's when this trade was a mistake. And now, even if Yeager gets to the NHL and is an impact player before McGroarty, and then they end up being kind of similar players or contributing to similar levels after that, you still look at it and say, man, should I stayed with Braden Yeager? Because that was the whole point of the trade is McGroarty will be an impact player before Yeager. That doesn't mean McGroarty's going to be an impact player right away, just before Braden Yeager would be able to. And Yeager's not going to make it to the NHL this season. He's back in the W. And Yeager might not make it to the NHL next season, or at the very least, early next season. So there's some time here to let Rutger McGroarty acclimate to the professional game and see how he progresses from there. He's still only played under 10 professional hockey games. That's NHL and AHL. It's going to take a little bit of time for him to adapt, a little bit of time for him to get his feet underneath him, and a little bit of time before he starts to contribute at the level that everybody wants him to contribute at. Let's go over to Mac Brunson, who says, do you believe that the Penguins will trade players who are playing well, i.e. a Rickard Rakell, a Ryan Graves, a Lars Eller, at the deadline to maximize the return? That question is dependent upon where the Penguins are at that moment in time. If it persists to go the way that they are right now, they're not going to wait to the trade deadline. They're going to start selling off pieces. If they start to perform better and are in a playoff spot, then I think you see them kind of toe the line of buyers and sellers. I think you see them potentially sell a player that hasn't, that's performed well, but isn't detrimental. And then maybe they bring back a young player that gives them an opportunity, or maybe they just sell off because they have a young player that's waiting in the wings. I mean, Valtteri Puustinen, I think, has played very well in his limited opportunity this season. It seems like they are destined to just keep him as a 13th forward. They're not going to ship him down to the AHL unless something drastic happens. So he needs and deserves more opportunities to get into the lineup. If they get to the trade deadline and they're kind of teetering on that playoff position, maybe you trade an Anthony Beauvillier if he has any value at that point, just to get a younger player like a Puustinen, like maybe a Ponomarev once he comes back healthy and if he performs well at the American Hockey League level, like a Ville Koivunen. So I think that's what you're more likely to see. I don't think the Penguins are going to expend assets to bring in players. I think they're more likely to sell, but how many players they sell is going to be, and when, is going to be dependent upon how they perform leading up to those moments and in these next couple of months. Let's go over to Colton, who says, who do you think comes out of the lineup once Lizotte and Nieto are healthy? The Nieto thing is surprising to me because I thought there was a chance that Matt Nieto just stayed on the injury report and stayed on LTIR all season, and they just said, all right, we're going to part ways at the end of the year, because even before he was injured last year, wasn't looking good. But the fact that he came out on the ice in training camp, skating on his own, he's progressed to this point to now where he's skating in a full contact uniform in practice, that raises major questions. I am extremely excited to see Blake Lizotte in this lineup. I think if you like what you've seen out of Cody Glass, you're going to like what you see out of Blake Lizotte 100%. But once those two are healthy, they're not going to get sent down. And maybe that's when Valtteri Puustinen ends up having to go down to the American Hockey League level. He would have to go through waivers, which scares me a little bit because I want to see him get an opportunity. But I would think that Puustinen is one of them, because at this point, it kind of seems like Lizotte and Nieto are destined to come back before Brian Rust. So Rust is already out of the lineup. I think Puustinen's a guy that's going to jump out of the lineup. And I think that you could see an Anthony Beauvillier get sat down, because really he's been wholly unimpressive to this point. Yeah, he's been able to finish. Yes, I think he's been better than he was last year in his multiple stops in multiple different cities. But I do think that he's a guy that maybe gets taken out for a Blake Lizotte. And if they want to put Matt Nieto in 100%, I could see that being the case as well. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Lenny says, Matt Grzelcyk not actually looking up the actual last name spelling. Cap hit is looking horrendous right about now. Yes, but at the same time, it's what you can come to expect from the Pittsburgh Penguins right now. It's what you can come to expect really going forward from Kyle Dubas and the Pittsburgh Penguins. He wasn't going to give out a huge multi-year contract. He was going to give out kind of a show me deal and bank on the fact that Matt Grzelcyk at one point was a top pairing defenseman and a pretty darn good top pairing defenseman in the NHL. And you're hoping that giving him that opportunity in Pittsburgh with a fresh start was able to kind of get him back to that level. But alas, through 11 games, which there's still time to change it, but through 11 games, it looks pretty bad. But that's what you can expect from the Penguins. It's that type of contract. It's trading for guys like Kevin Hayes, who, in that instance, it's worked out. Let's not forget, though, the Penguins did that to get the draft pick. They took on Kevin Hayes' salary cap hit to help out the St. Louis Blues and get that off of their sheet to take on the draft pick. That was the main reason for that trade. And it's worked out because Kevin Hayes has been good for the Penguins to this point in the season. They did the same thing with Matt Grzelcyk on the opening day of free agency. They brought him in, tried to give him an opportunity to bounce back and look at that as a, hey, if he does bounce back, we can either one, re-sign him for the future and keep that train rolling. Two, trade him for assets and turn something that was a free agent signing into some future picks and help that rebuild. Or three, if he's bad and he has kind of no value after the season, it's only 1 year. You can cut bait and move on. So that's the reason they did that. That's the reason they did a lot of the signings that they did this summer. And that's something you're just going to have to come to expect from the Penguins because, like it or not, they're out of that window where they're just going to go for it every year. They're not going to quote unquote go for it in free agency anymore. Not until they start to come back on the upswing of that contention window, the proverbial roller coaster that is contending in the NHL. They're on the downswing right now. And because of that, Kyle Dubas is not going to expand assets, part of that being years and salary cap space to bring in players in the open market. So hence the reason you go after guys like a Matt Grzelcyk. You go after guys like an Anthony Beauvillier. So as much as he hasn't performed up to this point, yeah, the cap hit looks rough, but it's what you should come to expect from now until really probably 3 or 4 years down the road when they start to turn that tide after they hit the bottom. Let's go over to Erik P, who says, checking some more questions. Erik P says, does Quinn factor into the lack of defensive responsibility? I don't think there's any person, player, personnel, coach, front office member that is absolved from the way the Penguins have played defense. Because it's not just the defenders. Yeah, the blue liners are bad, and that falls on Quinn because that's his primary responsibility. But it falls on Mike Sullivan too. It's his system. It falls on the guys that are on the ice. They're the ones playing. It falls on Mike Vellucci because guess what? The forwards aren't helping defensively either. It falls on everybody in that organization how poor they have been on the defensive side of the puck. You can't just put it on one guy because it takes a group effort to be that bad. And that's where you're looking at right now with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Let's go over to Golden Doodles for Life. I love it. Says, who can be sent down without having to go through waivers? Might as well see some guys from the baby Pens. Why not? Here's the thing. There is only, let me think, unless I'm missing one, only 2 players right now on the NHL roster that can get sent down without having to go through waivers. Jack St. Ivany, who's playing well, and I don't think there's anybody on the baby Pens that you're going to bring up to be a third pairing defenseman. And I said this yesterday on the live stream. The third pairing hasn't been the problem this year. Have they been great? No, but they have not been the worst. In fact, they've probably been the most consistent defensive pairing for the Penguins. And there's nobody in the AHL that's going to come up and play in your top 4. So Jack St. Ivany is one option. The only other player is Yoel Blomqvist. And we all know that right now he is the best goaltender the Penguins have. So you don't really have anybody that you can send down without putting them through waivers. So you're going to have to put somebody through waivers if you want to see a Sam Poulin, if you want to see trying to think of other players that have performed well down there. Emil Bemstrom has performed well down there. Chicken a la King says Bemstrom and Poulin have been a point per game player right now and have built some chemistry. There you go. Those are players I think the Penguins could try out here at some point. But again, you'd have to put somebody on waivers. There'd have to be a roster spot that opens up. And as we talked about earlier, with Matt Nieto and Blake Lizotte potentially coming back, playing time and ice time and opportunity is going to be a little bit harder to come by for some of these younger players for a little while. Speaking of Chicken a la King, says it's a shame that Sergei Mershov is in Wheeling. Yeah, I think he's probably at a higher level than ECHL hockey right now, but at the same time, you needed that AHL ice time for Tristan Jarry. And Murshov's only 20 years old. You got time, right? That doesn't mean that he's never going to make it to the NHL. In fact, with the level of play that he has had this calendar year, I wouldn't be surprised if he's back in the AHL by the end of the season. I wouldn't be surprised if he's back in the AHL the second Tristan Jarry comes back up to the NHL level. So it is a shame that he got sent down, but that's just sometimes when you have a crowded goaltending room when it comes to the NHL, the AHL, and the ECHL. This organization has a lot of goaltenders. They do. And Tristan Jarry was expected to be an NHL guy. He hasn't been to this point, so you had to make room for him somewhere. You had to get him ice time somewhere, and it's better to get him ice time at the AHL level so he can kind of work on the fundamentals of playing his position, because that's what was off the entire time. You need to let him do that at the AHL level versus bringing him up to the NHL level. Could you imagine how bad these games would have been? The Edmonton game when there was 50 shots on goal, the Minnesota game last night, if Tristan Jarry was between the pipes the way that he was playing, it would have been 8-0, 10-0 losses. So you had to get him some ice time somewhere. It does stink that because of that, Sergei Murashov goes to Wheeling, but also it's best for him in that he's going to get the opportunity to play, and only Philip Larson is the guy that ends up sitting the bench for the next 2 weeks. So it's a shame, but at the same time, as we talked about with Jarry, it's the right move to make. Mac Brunson says, if you're the general manager, who would you target via trade to make the team better? Or would you commit to selling? I've been pretty open about the fact that the way that this team has played this year, I'm not spending assets to bring them any help, right? Because you can't trade away picks, you can't trade away prospects at this point. You need all of them because the cabinet is more stocked than it was before, but it's still pretty barren, and you're going to need to hit on a historically high number of these prospects to be able to kind of shorten that window. So you need to continue to bring prospects and picks in. I don't think that you can trade any of those for players to help this team right now because they haven't shown that they deserve it, right? Maybe you try a player for player swap with another player that's struggling and you try to get him that kind of fresh start. We saw Jim Rutherford try to do that with Carl Hagelin and Tanner Pearson, and that one backfired. So even that, you're taking a risk, you're taking a gamble that it's going to pay off. If I'm the general manager, I commit to selling. Now, do I agree that Kyle Dubas is probably going to wait this out a little bit longer, probably past the roster freeze and Christmas break? Yeah, I agree with that because the fact is the bottom six was fine to start the season. The special teams was fine to start the season. The goaltending was subpar when Tristan Jarry was up here, and the top six was subpar for a lot of the early portions of the season, especially the Crosby line. So I think you do afford them a little bit of time. If Crosby gets back on track, you put that bottom six together again and see if they can pick up where they left off. And if that's the case, you would imagine they would start to win hockey games. You have to give them the opportunity to do that. Crosby played well last night. If he can continue to progress, that's when I think you start to have that conversation of how long do we wait if you're the general manager. But I'm certainly not making a trade to make this team better. I'm certainly not making a trade where I have to give up draft picks and give up prospects, especially once, like if it's a 7th round pick, that's a different question. What are we talking about here? But if you want a 4th or a 3rd round pick for a player right now, if I'm the Penguins, I'm saying that player better be a slam dunk to come in, fit well, and help this team succeed, because otherwise I'm not taking the gamble. Dapton says, finally caught alive. LOL. What did you think of the two-headed monster line last night? Talked about this a little bit earlier, but since you finally joined back, I'll give you my kind of Spark Notes version of what I thought. I thought they looked good. I thought they looked really good. Evgeni Malkin was held off the score sheet, but I thought he had that patented gallop in. I thought Sidney Crosby looked the best that he's looked outside of the Buffalo Sabres game. I think Rickard Rakell looks like a bona fide top-line winger, as he typically does when he's with Sidney Crosby. I liked that line. What I also saw was them give up as many opportunities as they created, which is a problem. It's a problem with the whole team, but especially with the top line. What I also saw was the bottom 9 not create very much of anything. I could probably count on one hand the amount of shifts that I would consider a positive from that bottom 9 than anything last night. All 3 lines combined. So it's exactly what you would expect. The top line does their job. The top line creates. The bottom 9, you're going to need more out of them. And is that a lot to ask? Yes, because you have Nola Chari on a second forward line. It's not great, Bob. It's not great. So you shouldn't expect them to go out there and get a bunch from the bottom. But at the same time, I liked what I saw out of the top line. I liked that it kind of woke up Sidney Crosby. Lenny says, would you take Carolina's despicable system if it gave Pittsburgh a better chance at winning? Yes, I'll do anything if it gives my team a better chance at winning. If I'm the head coach, if I'm Mike Sullivan and the team comes to me and says, you know what, we think we can execute the Carolina system to perfection. We think that will make us a playoff team. At the very least, you listen. If you agree with it, you listen. Do I think the Penguins are capable of that with the players that they have? Less than likely is what I'll say. I don't think they have the horses to be able to do what Carolina has done over the past couple of seasons under Rod Brindamore. Let's go to Ace80, who says, does Owen Pickering move into the top 4 if Pettersson gets moved at the deadline? Probably not this season, but depending upon how he plays this year, yeah, maybe he makes that jump, and maybe that's somebody that you give the opportunity to do so next year. The way that Ryan Graves is playing right now, I wouldn't be opposed to giving him another opportunity in the top 4. Now, again, Ryan Graves does not mesh well with Chris Letang or Erik Karlsson. So at the end of the day, you're always going to be setting him up for failure to some extent. But right now, the way Matt Grzelcyk's playing versus the way Ryan Graves is playing, it's worth a shot. And honestly, you're not going to get rid of Ryan Graves. You can't. That contract is immovable. He was that bad last year that it's going to take him looking like a Norris Trophy contender for other teams to take that seriously as a trade piece right now because of that contract and because of how bad he was last year. So maybe you give Ryan Graves a shot. Maybe if Owen Pickering doesn't wow you in the summer and doesn't wow you this season, you bring in somebody else and you see how he progresses. But I think that is the beginning of the timeline for Owen Pickering, is the beginning of next year, to see if he can progress far enough to where he gets on the NHL roster first, and then you can see whether or not he gets that top 4 role. I think that was a big issue with what happened with P.O. Joseph in Pittsburgh. I think he was pushed just a little too quickly into high leverage situations, into high leverage, opportunities, and he just wasn't ready for it, and he was never able to adapt to it. He was fine in those bottom pairing roles for large portions of his career in Pittsburgh, but I think he was just given too much responsibility too quickly, and it kind of stunted his growth and kind of affected his development a little bit. I don't want them to do the same thing with Pickering, especially because he is one of the few defensive prospects the Penguins have. Brunick, we'll see what happens with Brunick next year. It'll be interesting. Mac Brunson, we're only going to do a handful more of these before we go because we're breaching on an hour here. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Appreciate everybody getting active in the comment section. I love what Brian just said because it kind of harkens back to a discussion that me and Brian had yesterday live on the watch along. But Max says, weird thought, but if it's March or April and the Pens are really bad, should they say screw it and play Rutger for 20 plus minutes? Yes. Yeah. If they're really bad in March and April and they end up selling at the deadline at that point should be for 2 reasons. One, gather as many assets as you can. Draft picks, prospects, young NHL players needing a new start. As many of those assets as possible. And secondly, clear out as much of the whiteboard so you can plug and play these young players at will. Rutger McGroarty, Ville Koivunen, Owen Pickering at that point, if he's performing well, give him some ice time. I think Vasily Ponomarev is another name. Jonathan Gruden, can he be part of your bottom 6 going forward? I think so. So that is 100% what I would look at, is if you're at the point where you're in March and April, which I do believe that Rutger McGroarty will be back up at the NHL by that point anyway, whether or not the Penguins are good or bad. At that point, if they are really bad in March and April, Rutger McGroarty should be among the team leaders in ice time to let him, if he's prepared for it, if he's performing to that level, to get his feet underneath him, because that's what you're going to expect him to be throughout his career, as a guy that's going to take 18 to 20 minutes of ice time and be a top 6 forward. Chicken a la King says, are you dressing up for Halloween? I went to a Halloween party Saturday, and I dressed up as a lumberjack because it was a last-minute costume. Tomorrow, we'll see. I'm doing the live stream. I'm doing the watch-along. It is Halloween. The Pens are playing a team that wear orange and black. Maybe. We'll have to see what I can kind of queue up as far as the costume department. I don't have a lot of costumes on hand, so maybe I will, maybe I won't. You'll have to tune in to find out tomorrow on the live stream. Brian says, just got back from my walk. For those who weren't tuned in late last night, Brian said 80 saves on 88 shots in 2 games for Joel Blomqvist. That made him mad, and he went on a walk. He left the live stream and went on a walk. And honestly, he was tuned in the whole night, so I couldn't blame him. Brian also has a question here that says, Do you buy that a future Hall of Famer and Karlsson can't adjust his game to a more responsible one? I don't know much about him. He's known as a team guy. He is known as a team guy. And honestly, everything that I've seen kind of leads to that being true. I know there's a lot of stuff that came out last week whenever he was asked how he would grade his performance, how he would say his performance is, and he said great. Rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He was short with that answer. Everything I've seen is Karlsson is a team guy. I don't know where this diva moniker comes from. Probably a lot of it coming from San Jose when him and Brent Burns reportedly, again, never founded, but reportedly never got along. He's not a diva. To me, he just seems like a good teammate. He seems like a guy that the Penguins are happy to have in their locker room, happy to have as a leader in that locker room. But I will say, I do buy the fact that he's not going to be able to kind of adjust and adapt to be a more responsible player. He's never been that player. When he was 12 years old, he wasn't that player. I don't think he's going to start doing it. You know, the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I don't think you're going to teach Erik Karlsson to be a more responsible defender. Yeah, maybe more than what he has been this season, because in his career, he has at the very least been better than this. This is the basement level of defensive efficiency. But I don't think you're ever going to have him being a player that is considered a plus or a positive player on the defensive side of the ice. And let's close it out with Dapton says, thoughts on the Nurse trade rumor. Would he fit the Sullivan system? I don't want Darnell Nurse. What is his contract? The Penguins are already flush with bad contracts. Unless the Oilers are willing to, oh my God, what year of he's in year 3 of an 8-year deal and gets paid $9 million. That's the end of that discussion. Would he fit the Sullivan system? We don't have to have that discussion, because the end of the discussion is his contract in Edmonton. That right now, Penguins are not taking on that deal unless they're offered 4 first-round picks from Edmonton to take that on. Let's close it out with Fuzzy Hobbit, who says, score prediction against the Ducks. My gut says we get scrappy in a 2-1 win. That is a bold gut that you have there, because the Penguins have given up 3 or more goals in all 11 games this season. We need to get an ugly one to get things going. I agree with that one. Score prediction, because I don't see the Penguins defense getting any better, and I like the Ducks forward core. I think there's a lot of young talent that's going to give the Penguins fits, and they're certainly going to get a lot of odd man rushes because Penguins give up a lot, and the Ducks like to capitalize on those. I'll say the Penguins get a win. I'll say the Penguins end their losing streak tomorrow. They get the win by a final score of 4-3. That's what I got for the Pittsburgh Penguins against the Anaheim Ducks. But that's going to do it, for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. That was so bad. I am so sorry I just did that. But that's going to do it for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or anywhere you get your podcast from. And one last reminder, since it is October, make sure you check out the link in our description below to get your Tip of the Ice-Burgh Hockey Fights Cancer men's and women's t-shirts and hoodies, with 100% of the profits being donated directly to breast cancer research and awareness. But that's going to do it for this one. We'll see you guys next time.